She had 47 cents, a sick child who couldn't breathe, and a town full of neighbors who turned their backs the moment a powerful man pointed his finger at her and called her a thief. And the only person who stepped out of that crowd, the only one who wrapped his coat around her daughter and carried her up a mountain in the freezing dark, was a man the whole territory had already condemned as a killer. What happens when two broken people, each carrying a wound the world says they can never heal from, decide to stop running and turn around to face the storm together? Stay with me, because before this story ends, you'll understand that true courage isn't found in a gunfight in the town square. It's found in a woman who stitches a man's artery together by lamplight, picks up a rifle she's never fired, and walks back into the valley that tried to erase her. Not for revenge, but to save the names of 12 families who were too afraid to save themselves.
The fog didn't rise off Coldwater Creek that Friday morning. It just sat there, thick and gray, hugging the rough-hewn pine of the market stalls like a damp shroud. It was barely 7. The air tasted of wood smoke and frost. Evelyn Thorne slipped her hand into her apron pocket. Her fingers counted the coins but touch alone. 3 dimes, 3 nickels, 2 copper cents, 47 cents in total. The rent on her small shack at the edge of town was $2, due on Tuesday. She had exactly 4 days to find the rest. Behind her, sitting on an empty flour crate, 9-year-old Lily let out a sharp, wet cough. The cold always caught the girl in the chest first, tightening her lungs until every breath sounded like dry paper tearing. Evelyn didn't turn around to show her worry. Mother's fear is a contagious thing, and Lily had enough to carry. Instead, Evelyn took the last loaf of sourdough from the wooden tray. She broke it in 2. One side was a heavy, thick hunk, the other was little more than a crust. She turned and handed the larger piece to the girl. "Eat up, Lilybud. Keep the chill out." Lily looked at the small crust left in her mother's hand. "What about your breakfast, Mama?" "This crust is plenty for me," Ellen said, her voice steady as an anvil. "A small bite keeps a person sharp. A heavy stomach just makes a body lazy before the work is even done." That was the first lesson she gave her daughter every day. Spoken straight, poverty was a condition of the purse, not the character. You didn't beg, and you didn't look at a smaller portion as a defeat. Across the muddy thoroughfare, the other vendors were setting out their wares. Updegraff with his salted meats, Mrs. Gable with her woven blankets. Of them looked Evelyn S. way. They weren't wicked people, not exactly, but in the Wyoming Territory in 1878, a penniless immigrant widow with a sick child was a bad omen. People thought if they looked too hard at misery, it might decide to follow them home. Evelyn accepted their silence. Silence didn't cost a dime. Around 8, the crowd thickened. The wealthy folk from the brick houses near the bank arrived. Among them was Margaret Hargrove, the banker's wife, draped in fine wool that smelled of lavender and eastern lavender water. She pushed past Evelyn's small table, her velvet reticule catching on a splintered post. The bag slipped. It hit the dirt with a soft, heavy thud. Mrs. Hargrove kept walking, unnoticing. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind her table, picked the velvet pouch from the mud, and hurried through the crowd. "Mrs. Hargrove," Evelyn called out, her accent catching slightly on the hard English consonants. "Ma'am, you dropped this." The banker's wife stopped, turned, and took the bag. She didn't look Evelyn in the eye, not really. She looked at Evelyn's frayed cuffs, then at the mud on the velvet. She gave a curt nod, muttered a muffled thank you, and walked on. Evelyn went back to her table. She didn't feel insulted. Her actions spoke what she didn't say. A loud honesty wasn't something you traded for a smile or a tip. You did the right thing because your soul required it, even if the person receiving it didn't think you possessed a soul at all. 15 minutes later, the air in the market changed. Idle chatter died down, replaced by the heavy measured crunch of boot heels on frozen gravel. Sheriff Mordecai Blackwood walked through the clearing. He was a large man, his broad shoulders filling out a sheepskin coat that had cost more than Evelyn made in a year. 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting casually near their holsters. Blackwood didn't look like a tyrant. He looked like a man who believed his own myth. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn's table. The crowd parted, forming a wide, silent circle. "Evelyn Thorne," Blackwood said. His voice was deep, resonant, loud enough to carry to the far edge of the livery stable. "Stand up." Evelyn didn't move at first. She kept her hands flat on the wooden table. Then slowly she rose. She didn't cower. She kept her chin parallel to the dirt. "Sheriff? Margaret Hargrove just reported her velvet coin purse missing," Blackwood stated, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "A reliable witness saw you hovering near her coat, saw you pick something up from the ground, and saw you conceal it. Arresting you for the theft." A collective murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Hargrove was nowhere to be seen. She had already gone inside the dry goods store, leaving the law to do its ugly work. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. But her voice remained locked in place. "I returned the bag to her, Sheriff. I picked it up to give it back. There were no coins taken." "That's for a judge to decide," Blackwood said, but Evelyn knew the truth, and the memory flashed behind her eyes like lightning. 3 days ago, she had gone to Blackwood's office to ask about the winter market permit. He had been out. On his desk, a leather-bound ledger had been left open. Her eyes had caught the copperplate handwriting, a list of 12 immigrant properties marked for imminent reclamation by the Central Mountain Railroad Company. One plot of land, the small acre her husband had cleared before the mine collapse, was at the top of the list. Blackwood had caught her looking at the desk. When he walked back in, he hadn't said anything then, but his eyes had turned predatory. This wasn't about a velvet purse. This was about clearing the board. Blackwood leaned over the table, his shadow blotting out the morning sun. He didn't reach for his irons. Instead, he lowered his voice, though the words were still sharp enough to cut. "I won't disgrace this town by dragging a woman in chains past her child," he murmured, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "So I'm going to give you a choice, Mrs. Thorne. You and the girl have 48 hours to pack your trunk and get across the county line. If you're still here come Sunday night, I'll lock you in the stone cell, and the girl goes on the orphan train to Omaha. Thief don't get to keep her kin." The threat hung in the cold air. Lily let out a small, terrified sob from behind the crate. Evelyn looked around the circle of her neighbors. Updegraff looked at his boots. Mrs. Gable turned her back entirely. The silence of the crowd was a lesson in itself, loud and clear. When the law becomes a weapon for the powerful, the weak will look away to save their own skin. Keyed-up justice was a luxury none of them could afford. 48 hours, Blackwood repeated. He turned on his heel and walked away, his deputies following like dogs. The market returned to life, but the space around Evelyn remained empty. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody bought her bread. Evelyn didn't cry. Couldn't afford the moisture. She knelt by the flour crate, lifted Lily into her arms, and began to walk. The girl was trembling, her chest rattling with that awful, dry wheeze. Evelyn didn't know where she was going. Her home was no longer a home, it was a target. She just walked toward the western edge of town, where the dirt road began its long, lonely climb toward the base of Blackridge Mountain. The wind blew harder there, carrying the scent of pine needles and coming snow. Lily's head slumped against Evelyn's shoulder, her breathing growing shallower by the minute. Evelyn's legs felt like lead. She stumbled on a frozen rut, nearly dropping the child. She stayed on her knees for a moment, the gravel biting through her skirts. Then a shadow fell over her. It wasn't Blackwood. This shadow was wider, taller, smelling of wood tar, horse sweat, and old leather. And looked up. The man standing over her looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. His coat was heavy, grease-stained buckskin. A thick, untamed beard hid most of his face, save for a long, white scar that ran from his left ear down to the corner of his jawline. His eyes were a startling, piercing blue, the color of river ice. It was Silas Vane, the mountain man, the hermit of Blackridge. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He didn't ask her if she was all right. He had been standing near the livery stable when Blackwood made his speech. He had seen the whole damn play. Silas looked down at Lily. He saw the blue tint around the little girl's lips, heard the whistling in her throat. Without a word, he unbuttoned his buckskin coat. Beneath, he wore a thick wool shirt. He stripped the coat off and wrapped it entirely around Lily, swallowing her small frame in the heavy, warm leather. Then he looked at Evelyn. His voice was low, a deep, gravelly rumble like stones tumbling down a dry creek bed. "The child needs fire," Silas said, "and she needs it now. Nora Finch keeps the stoves hot at the inn. Follow the tree line behind the creek. It avoids the main street." Evelyn stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. In town they whispered that Silas Vane was a madman, a killer who had fled the east to hide his sins in the high timber. But as she looked into those icy blue eyes, she didn't see madness. She saw a strange, heavy stillness. "Why are you helping us?" she whispered. "The sheriff said I am a thief. The whole town believes him." Silas picked up Lily as if the 9-year-old weighed no more than a bundle of kindling. He began to walk toward the hidden path behind the creek, not checking to see if Evelyn was following. A badge don't make a man a truth-teller, Silas said over his shoulder, his words sparse and hard-bitten. And a lack of money don't make a woman a rogue. A man who judges a person by the words of his enemy is a fool, Mrs. Thorne. I ain't a fool. Evelyn stood up, wiped the frozen mud from her knees, and followed the mountain man into the trees. The air didn't just get colder as they climbed Black Ridge, it got thinner, sharper, tasting less of the town's coal smoke and more of old stone and frozen hemlock. Silas Vane walked ahead. He didn't look back to see if Evelyn was keeping up. He didn't need to. Her boots made a distinct, stubborn rhythm against the frozen gravel crunch. Scrap crunched. He carried Lily against his chest, wrapped in that massive buckskin coat. The girl had stopped shaking about a mile back, her breathing settling into a steady, shallow hum against his shoulder. The trail narrowed where the spruce trees grew thick. Boulders the size of hay wagons leaned over the path, smooth and gray from 1,000 years of mountain ice. Evelyn caught her toe on a hidden root. She didn't cry out, but her breath hitched as she threw her weight forward to keep from pitching into the ravine. Silas stopped. He didn't turn his whole body, just angled his head so she could see the white line of the scar on his jaw. The grade gets steeper past the twin pines, he said. His voice was just a low rumble, barely louder than the wind through the needles. Don't look at the summit. Look 3 feet ahead of your own toes. The mountain don't conquer a body all at once. It does it inch by inch, while you're busy looking at the top. Evelyn straightened her shawl, pulling it tight across her chest. I can manage, Mr. Vane. I ain't doubting your will, ma'am, Sis said, stepping forward again. Will don't change the laws of gravity. A mountain don't care about your reasons for climbing it. It treats a saint and a horse thief exactly the same. You respect the ground under your boots, or the ground takes you. That was the first thing she noticed about him up close. He didn't talk like the men in town. He didn't use words to grease a conversation or make a lady feel small. He spoke about the earth like it was a landlord who collected rent in bone and blood. They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, turning the sky the color of a bruised plum. It wasn't a home meant for company. It sat in a notch of gray rock, built from heavy logs that had turned nearly black from winter storms. The roof was low, weighed down with sod and heavy river stones to keep the wind from ripping the shingles away. There were no flowers in the windows, no rocking chair on the porch. Just a stack of split pine that rose higher than a horse's shoulder and a heavy oak door with an iron latch. Silas kicked the door open with the heel of his boot. The inside smelled of tallow, wood tar, and dried sage. It was clean, scoured down to the grain of the floorboards, but it was bare. A single iron cot sat in the corner by the hearth. A heavy trestle table occupied the center of the room, flanked by 2 stools carved from pine stumps. Along the back wall stood a row of rough shelves, completely packed with leather-bound books. Silas laid Lily down on the cot, pulling a gray wool blanket over her up to her chin. The girl didn't wake. She just sighed, her small face pale but relaxed. In the sudden heat of the room, he went to the hearth. He didn't use matches. He took a piece of flint and a steel striker from a tin on the mantel. With 3 quick practice strokes, he dropped a spark into a nest of dried cedar bark. A small tongue of yellow flame licked up, and he fed it slivers of fatwood until the stone chimney began to draw, filling the room with a deep, roaring heat. Evelyn stood by the door, her hands still tucked into her apron. She didn't sit. She didn't take off her shawl. Silas stood up, wiping the charcoal from his palms onto his trousers. He looked at her, then really looked at her for the first time since the market. You're safe from Blackwood here, he said. His horses are town-bred. They don't like the rocks after dark. I don't expect charity, Mr. Vane, Evelyn said, her accent flattening the vowels. I have no money to pay for this roof. The sheriff took my piece and he took my living. Silas walked to the shelves. He didn't look at the books. He looked at a small sack of cornmeal sitting on the bottom ledge. I don't give charity, he said, and I don't take it out here. A person who relies on another man's pity is dead before the snow flies. Like a trade, Mrs. Thorne. That's the only law that keeps a man honest when there ain't a marshal around. He held up 5 fingers, his hand broad and calloused as a spade. 5 rules, he said. First, you and the girl take the Lianto room behind the kitchen. I put a straw tick in there, but it holds the heat. Second, you don't ask about the scar, and you don't ask about the road that brought me to this mountain. I won't ask about yours. Evelyn nodded once. Fair enough, third, Silas continued. Work starts when the crows fly, 6 in the morning. There's wood to be sawed, meat to be salted, and the roof needs patching before the big freeze. You work for your bread, fourth. I cook the salt pork and the beans at night. If you want to handle the morning biscuits, the flour is in the barrel. You ain't obligated. He paused, his blue eyes dropping to her hands. They were small hands, but the skin around the knuckles was red and rough from the market tubs. And fifth, Evelyn asked, if any time you feel the mountain is too lonely, or you think you'd rather take your chances with the law in town, you tell me. We'll hitch the buckboard and drive you down to the railhead at Medicine. Bow, no arguments. Evelyn looked at her daughter on the cot. The girl's chest rose and fell, slow and easy. She looked back at Silas. He was a hard man, built by hard years, but there was no malice in his face. Sixth rule, Mr. Vane, she said. Silas tilted his head. State it. If Lily takes a spell, if her lungs lock up in the grease, don't break it. You take us down to Doc Price. Doesn't matter if it's midnight. Doesn't matter if the blizzard is blowing the pine sideways. You don't leave us up here to choke. Silas looked at her. He didn't blink. He seemed to be weighing her words, testing them for fluff or panic. Finding none, he gave a slow, solemn nod. Agreed, he said. He turned toward the hearth to stoke the fire. His actions were deliberate, quiet. It was the first lesson Evelyn took from the mountain itself. Out here, a contract wasn't a piece of paper signed with ink. An understanding between two souls who knew that survival was a cooperative business. He didn't offer her a soft word, but he gave her a place to stand. The next morning came before the sun had even cleared the ridges. The light was a dull, smoky blue when Silas tapped on the liento door with his knuckles. Crows are up, his voice carried through the pine planks. Evelyn was already dressed. She had pinned her hair back with her 2 remaining horn combs and tied her apron tight. When she stepped into the main room, a pile of rough-cut logs lay by the door, along with a Twuman crosscut saw. The wood by the shed is green oak, Silas said, nodding toward the door. It needs to be split and stacked 4 deep against the north wall. The frost is coming hard tonight. They took positions on either side of a 3-foot log. The saw was heavy, the steel cold enough to bite through her wool mittens. Don't push it, Silas said as she took the handle. You push a crosscut. The blade buckles and it pinches the wood. Just pull, let the teeth do the biting. When it's my turn, you let go. Your grip a little. We fighting the steel, Mrs. Thorne. We're working with it. Evelyn pulled. The saw shrieked as it took the wood. Silas pulled back, his shoulders moving with a slow, hypnotic grace. For the first 10 minutes she did it wrong. She used her biceps, her shoulders tensing up until her neck throbbed. The saw stuck twice, binding in the green sap. Silas didn't get angry. He didn't sigh. He just stopped, waited for her to reset her feet, and started the rhythm again. Seesaw. By the 3rd log she found the swing of it. She stopped fighting the blade. She let her hips take the weight, leaning back into the pull and letting her arms go slack when Silas pulled. The sawdust piled up in a clean, fragrant mound between them, smelling of summer rain and old earth. You see that? Silas said, his breath coming in short white puffs. The wood yields when you stop trying to master it. Most folks go through life trying to force things to bend to their strength, but strength ain't nothing without rhythm. You gotta find the seam in the day, Mrs. Thorne, and let the work carry itself. Evelyn didn't answer with words. She just pulled the saw. But inside, under the heavy wool of her bodice, something clicked. She had spent 3 years since her husband died fighting every single hour, fighting the market inspectors, fighting the rentmen, fighting the cold. She had been tensing her muscles against the whole world. Here, with this scarred giant on the dark side of a mountain, she was learning to let the weight shift. By noon, the stack against the wall was shoulder-high. Lily came out of the cabin, her cheeks pink from the cabin's heat. She didn't look afraid of Silas anymore. Children have an instinct for things that are solid. They don't mind a rough bark if the tree don't lean. Mr. Vane, Lily called out, her voice small but clear. Can I feed the horse? Silas set down his splitting maul. He looked at the girl, then at the barn down the path. Barn's cold, little miss, he said. The mare don't like strangers unless they carry corn. There's an ear in the bin by the door. Don't hold it with your fingers twisted up. Keep your palm flat. A horse don't mean to bite, but a finger looks a whole lot like a cob when a beast is hungry. He didn't follow her. He let the girl walk down the path alone, watching her from the corner of his eye while he wiped the sweat from his brow. Evelyn watched her daughter too. For months, Lily had stayed close to the stove in their rented shack, her breath too short for play. Now, under the wide, woming sky, the girl walked with her chin up, the wind blowing her yellow hair into her eyes. "She looks better," Evelyn said softly. Silas picked up his maul again. "The air up here don't owe nothing to the valley. It's clean because it don't stay long enough to get dirty." He went back to work, the iron head of the maul striking the oak logs with a sound like a rifle shot. Crack! Night, Evelyn made the bread. She found the flour barrel, but instead of the coarse gray meal she usually bought, this was white wheat, ground fine as silk. She mixed it with sour milk and salt, kneading the dough on the trestle table, while Silas cleaned his skinning knives by the fire. The room was silent, save for the wet thwack of the dough against the wood and the scrape of the whetstone. It wasn't a lonely silence. It was the kind of quiet that comes when the sun is down, the wood is split, and the door is barred against the dark. It was the first time in 3 years Evelyn didn't feel the phantom hand of the world reaching into her pocket to see what else it could take. The storm didn't come with thunder. It arrived on the 10th morning like a thief, slipping under the door in thin lines of white powder. By noon, the valley below Coldwater Creek was gone, swallowed by a gray wall of spinning flakes that turned the spruce trees into white ghosts. Inside the cabin, the light was yellow and small. Silas sat at the trestle table with a pair of leather reins, a copper awl, and a jar of neat's foot oil. His fingers, thick as winter sausages, moved with a strange, delicate precision as he punched holes into the stiff leather. Repairing a break near the bitstrap, Lily sat on the floor by the woodbox, a heavy book open across her knees. The Odyssey. The pages were thick, stained with tobacco juice and waterings from some long-forgotten camp. Manifest, Lily spelled out loud, her tongue clicking on the teeth. "Mama, what's this word say?" Evelyn was at the hearth, scraping the tallow from the iron skillet. Before she could speak, Silas answered from the table. "Manifest," he said, not looking up from his leatherwork. "It means something that's written down plain so nobody can argue it. Like a ship's cargo, or the intentions of a man's heart. If it's manifest, it's out in the light." Lily looked at the big letters. "Like the sun?" "Like the sun," Silas said. "A man can lie with his mouth, little miss, but his life usually makes things manifest anyway. You watch what a man does with his hands when he thinks nobody's looking. That is his ledger. That is his truth." Evelyn paused, her rag hovering over the iron pan. Looked at Silas' hands. They were covered in small dark marks, burns from black powder, old scars from ropes, and the deep permanent grease that comes from living around machinery. They were the hands of a man who had done hard things for a long time. Later that afternoon, while Lily was napping in the Lianto, Silas went out to check the oil in the barn. Evelyn took a broom to the storeroom behind the hearth to clear out the cobwebs that had drifted down from the rafters. The storeroom was small, filled with sacks of oats, dried apples, and a spare harness. In the corner behind an old iron stovepipe sat a small wooden sea chest. It wasn't locked. The lid was warped from dampness, showing a crack of dark interior. Evelyn didn't mean to pry, but as she moved the broom, her skirt caught on the corner of the chest, tipping it slightly. A small leather pouch slid out onto the floorboards with a metallic clink. She knelt and picked it up. The leather was supple, the kind used by government men back east. Inside was a silver star, its points blunt and worn from being carried in a pocket. Engraved across the center were the words Pinkerton Detective Agency, District of the Platte. Beneath the star was a folded square of newsprint, yellowed and brittle as an autumn leaf. Evelyn unfolded it with careful fingers. The date was June 1872. The headline was small but bold: "Train robbery suspect shot in Cheyenne. Pinkerton agent Vane linked to death of innocent clerk." The article was short. It spoke of a chase through the rail yards, a dark night, and a bullet fired by a Thyman-faced detective that had found the chest of a 19-year-old boy named Thomas Bird. The boy hadn't been a robber. He had just been running home before the curfew. Evelyn sat there on the floorboards, the paper rattling slightly in her fingers. The wind howled outside, throwing a fistful of sleet against the small, greasy windowpane. Understood the scar now. Not the one on his jaw, the one inside his chest that made him live 6 miles up a mountain where nobody could look him in the eye. He hadn't run from the law, he had run from his own reflection. A shadow filled the doorway of the storeroom. Silas stood there. His wool coat was white with snow, his beard frosted like an old cedar, his eyes fixed on the silver star in her palm, then dropped to the yellowed paper. The silence between them grew so heavy she could hear the hot sap popping in the hearth fire through the log wall. Silas didn't move. His jaw tightened, the white scar twitching against his dark skin. Evelyn didn't drop the star. She didn't look guilty. She folded the newspaper back into its exact creases, slid it into the leather pouch along with the silver badge, and set it gently back on the warped lid of the chest. "I didn't mean to disturb your property," she said, her voice quiet. Silas stepped into the room. He looked down at the chest, then at her. The anger she expected wasn't there. There was only a vast gray exhaustion. "You know now," he said. "I know what the paper says," Evelyn replied. "The paper told the truth," Silas said, his voice dropping into that dark, gravelly register. "I was fast, I was sure, I thought I was the lost right hand, and I didn't wait to see what was in the boy's fingers before I let the hammer go. He had a loaf of bread under his arm, Mrs. Thorne, not a colt." He turned his back to her, looking out the tiny window into the gray storm. "A mistake like that don't wash out," he muttered. "You carry it until your knees give out, and then you carry it some more. I don't go into town. The town is full of people who want you to tell them who's good and who's bad, but the line between runs right through the middle of every man's chest. I ain't fit to judge no more." Evelyn rose from the floor. She came up behind him, her boots quiet on the pine boards. She didn't touch his sleeve. She knew better than to handle a wounded wolf before it knew your scent, but she stood close enough to feel the cold radiating off his wool coat. "My husband died in the coal mine at Carbon," she said softly, 3 years back. "The shift boss told him the timbers were cracking, but the company needed 2 more cars before the whistle blew. Carl went back down, because we needed the 5 cents extra for Lily's shoes. The mountain took him." "Silas for 2 years," Evelyn said. "I woke up every morning hating the company, hating the shift boss, hating the very air of Huming. It didn't put shoes on Lily, and it didn't dig Carl out of the dark. It just turned my milk." She stepped past him into the kitchen, looking back over her shoulder. "The boy in Cheyenne is dead, Mr. Vane, but you ain't. And you didn't leave my daughter to choke in the mud on Friday morning. A man's life ain't a single ledger entry. It's the whole book. You made a bad entry in 7-2, but you've been writing clean lines ever since. If you don't start believing that, you're letting that old ghost do the plowing for the rest of your days." Silas didn't answer. He stood by the window for a long time, until the storm turned the glass completely black and the fire in the main room died down to red coals. Around sunset, the wind dropped to a low hiss. A sharp, heavy knock sounded against the cabin's front door 3 times. Thud, thud. Lily woke up with a start from the liento, her eyes wide with terror. Evelyn reached down instinctively, grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. Silas was already at the door. He didn't have his rifle in his hands, but his right arm was tucked slightly behind his hip, where his old service revolver sat in its oiled leather sheath. He lifted the iron latch and drew the door back 3 inches. An old man stood on the porch, wrapped in a buffalo robe that was thick with ice. His nose was red as a cherry, and his breath came in long, ragged gasps. It was Doc Emmett Price. Behind him, his old gray mule stood shivering in the lee of the woodpile. "Silas," the doctor wheezed, shaking the snow from his hood as he stepped into the warmth. "Thank God you're up." Nearly lost the trail at the creek. Silas closed the door and dropped the latch. "You're too old to be riding the ridge in a gale," Doc broke. Doc Price didn't look at Silas. He looked past him to where Evelyn stood with the poker. He gave her a tired, respectful nod. "The sheriff has been talking at the saloon," Mrs. Thorne, Price said, his voice trembling slightly from the cold. "He brought 2 regulators up from Cheyenne yesterday. Men named Dutch and Sam. They ain't lawmen, they're railroad enforcers. Blackwood told the town council you fled up here to avoid the warrant, and he's claiming Silas is harboring a fugitive." Evelyn felt a cold knot tighten in her belly. "He wants the land," the doctor agreed, taking a mug of hot tea that Evelyn handed him with a grateful nod. "The railroad company needs the right-of-way through the creek valley before the ground freezes in December. If they don't get the deeds signed, the contract lapses. Blackwood getting 20 cents an acre for every parcel he clears. Going to let an immigrant woman and a mountain hermit stand between him and $500. Silas sat down at the table, his face turning hard as iron. He looked at the silver star sitting on the sea chest in the corner, then back at the doctor. "When are they coming, Doc?" "Blackwood S. waiting for the drifts to pack," Price said, leaning close to the fire. "Maybe 2 days, maybe 3. He's going to bring enough men to make it look official. He told the town you're a dangerous man, Silas. He's escets, so nobody asks questions if you don't come down the mountain alive." Silas looked at Evelyn. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady on the handle of the fire poker. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally found the bottom of her fear and discovered it was solid rock. "We have 48 hours," Silas said. "What are you going to do?" the doctor asked. Silas reached over and picked up his leather reins, his big fingers tracing the new holes he had punched with the awl. "The mare shod for the ice," he said quietly. "Crosscut saw is sharp. We got wood to stack, Doc, and then we going to see about making things manifest." The wood frame office of the sheriff in Coldwater Creek smelled of wet pine, horse liniment, and the sour dregs of yesterday's coffee. It was a small room, but it held the whole valley in its grip. Sheriff Mordecai Blackwood sat behind his oak desk. He wasn't a small man, but the ledger open before him made him look hunched. His thumbs were tucked into his vest pockets, right over his brass badge. Outside, the noon sun was high, but it didn't do much to melt the gray slush in the street. A man stood by the window, chewing on a matchstick. His name was Arthur Whitmore. He wore a three-piece suit of fine gray wool, and his boots had never seen the inside of a barn. He was the representative for the Central Mountain Railroad Company. "The engineers are at the railhead in Medicine Bow," Whitmore said. He didn't look at Blackwood. He looked at his own reflection in the greasy glass. "They have 2 miles of steel ready to lay, but the grading crews won't move until the titles are clear. You told me the Thorne widow would be gone by Sunday." Blackwood spat a dark stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon by his desk. "Ping, she ain't in her shack," the sheriff said. "But she didn't take the stagecoach out neither. She went up. She's up on Blackridge with Silas Vane." Whitmore turned around. His eyes were small and dark, like 2 buckshot pellets pressed into lard. "The hermit, the one they say killed a boy in Cheyenne." "The same," Blackwood said, leaning back until the chair groaned. "Silas don't want no trouble with the law, but he's stubborn as an old mule when it comes to his timber. If East's keeping her there, it complicates things." Whitmore walked over to the desk. He leaned down, placing his manicured fingers on the ink-stained wood. "Town is like a clock, Sheriff," Whitmore said, his voice smooth as grease. "Every cog has to turn the same way for the machine to work. If one piece decides to stick, if a penniless widow thinks her 1 acre is worth more than the progress of the whole territory, the clock stops. You don't let a bad cog ruin the watch. You pull it out." Blackwood looked at his own knuckles. He had lived in Coldwater Creek for 12 years. He had started out honest enough. He remembered when his wife, Martha, was alive. She had taken the coughing sickness during the winter of 72. The medicine had cost $40 a bottle, shipped from Denver. He had taken his first $5 bribe from a cattle rustler to pay for that glass bottle. Martha died anyway. The $5 stayed in his pocket. After that, the bribes just got easier. It didn't feel like stealing anymore. It just felt like the price of staying alive in a country that didn't care if you lived or died. "I ain't going to murder an immigrant woman, Whitmore," Blackwood muttered. "Nobody asked for a funeral," Whitmore replied, straight-faced. "We just need her signature on the quitclaim deed. The railroad will pay her $50 for the land. That's 10 times what the dirt worth. If she signs, she can take her kid and go back to Pennsylvania or wherever she came from. If she stays up on that mountain, she's an outlaw harboring with a killer. You have a warrant for her arrest. Use it." Blackwood stood up. He adjusted his gun belt, feeling the weight of the Colt 44 against his hip. "I'm sending Dutch and Sam up the trail," Blackwood said. "They'll see how the wind blows. If Silas wants to play the hero, he find out the mountain ain't high enough to hide from a marshal's deed." 2 hours later, 2 men rode out of the livery stable. Was a tall, lean fellow with a mouth full of gray teeth and eyes that never stayed still. He carried a heavy Winchester carbine in his saddle scabbard. Sam rode behind him, shorter, broader, his face scarred by smallpox. They weren't lawmen. They were regulators, the kind of men who did the dirty work for the stock growers and the coal companies when the courts were too slow. Up on Blackridge, the world was white and still. Silas stood by his green woodpile, a heavy ashwood axe in his hands. He wasn't chopping. He was listening. The wind had dropped, and in the high timber, silence had a weight you could feel in your teeth. Evelyn came out of the cabin, a bucket of gray wood ash in her hands. She stopped when she saw his posture. "What is it?" Vane. Silas didn't turn around. He pointed the nose of the axe toward the lower trail, where the spruce trees gave way to the scrub oak. A mile down, 2 dark specks were moving against the snow, horses moving slow, single file. "Company," Silas said. Evelyn set the bucket down. Her face didn't go soft with fear this time. She had spent 10 days on this mountain, and her skin had taken on the color of the pine bark. Is it Blackwood? No, Silas said, squinting through the glare. The sheriff don't ride a lineback dun. That's Dutch horse. I seen it at the blacksmith last month. They're coming to scout the clearing. They won't make a move until they know how many rifles we got. He turned to her, then his blue eyes cold as creek water. Where the trail forks, Mrs. Thorne, Silas said, his voice flat. A man can run from past until his boots wear thin, but sooner or later, the past catches up and demands a reckoning. You can take Lily and hide in the root cellar behind the barn. Or you can stand on the porch with the shotgun, but you gotta choose. Out here, a person who sits on the fence gets ripped by the wire. Evelyn looked down the mountain. She could see the smoke from the town chimneys 5 miles away. A thin blue smudge against the gray sky. That town had called her a thief. That town had looked away when her child was choking. The root cellar is cold, Mr. Vane, Evelyn said, her voice small, but hard as an iron nail, and I've had enough of hiding in the dark. They'll get the double barrel from behind the kitchen door. Silas didn't smile. He didn't have the face for it, but the line of his jaw relaxed just a fraction. The breach open until you're on the porch, he said. A loaded gun in a nervous hand is just a tragedy waiting for a place to happen. We don't shoot unless they cross the ditch by the Twin Pines. That is my property line. Past that ditch, the law belongs to whoever's holding the lead. The horses didn't reach the clearing until the shadows had stretched across the snow like blue fingers. Dutch and Sam didn't ride in like desperate men. They rode slow, their hands resting flat on their thighs. Their hats pulled low against the glare of the setting sun. They stopped 20 yards out, right at the edge of the irrigation ditch Silas had dug 3 summers ago. Silas stood on the cabin porch, his arms crossed over his chest. His Winchester was leaning against the log wall behind him, within easy reach of his right hand. Evelyn stood 3 feet away, the heavy 12-gauge shotgun held across her apron, her fingers clear of the triggers but her thumbs resting on the hammers. Afternoon, Silas, Dutch called out. His horse shifted, its breath turning to white steam in the cold air. We re-out looking for some stray steers from the box elder outfit. Any up this way. The only beef on this mountain is in my salt barrel, Dutch, Silas said. His voice didn't carry across the clearing, it just dropped into the snow. And you're a long way from the box elder. Sam looked at Evelyn, his pockmarked face twitching into a greasy grin. The sheriff says you got some stolen property up here, Vane. Says a woman from town took some silver from the bank folk. We just here to help her find her way back to the jailhouse. Evelyn didn't wait for Silas to speak. She stepped to the edge of the porch, the sunlight catching the gray hairs at her temples. The only thing stolen on this mountain is the truth, she said, her voice clear as a bell in the frozen air. You tell Mordecai Blackwood that I know about the ledger. I know about the 12 families he's trying to starve out for the railroad money. A badge don't give a man the right to swallow another person. Bread ain't going down. Dutch grin died. He looked at Silas, his hand twitching toward his scabbard. You harboring a fugitive, Vane? That's a federal matter. Pinkertons used to hang men for less than that. Silas reached back and took the Winchester by the neck. He didn't raise it. He just held it flat against his thigh. I don't belong to the agency no more, Dutch, Silas said. And I don't take orders from men who sell their neighbors for 20 cents an acre. You ride back down this trail while the light is still good. If your horses are still in my timber when the moon clears that ridge, I'm going to start treating you like timber wolves, and I don't waste lead on a wolf's legs. For 5 seconds nobody breathed. Dutch looked at the Winchester in Silas' hand, then at the double barrel in Evelyn's grip. He was a bully, but he wasn't a fool. He knew Silas' reputation from the old days in Cheyenne. A man who has already killed an innocent boy don't usually hesitate when he is looking at a guilty one. We'll be back, Silas, Dutch muttered, pulling his horse head around. The law's got a long arm. Reach up a hill. The 2 men trotted their horses back into the spruce trees, the sound of the hooves fading into the dark timber. Silas didn't put the rifle down until the trail was completely silent. He turned to Evelyn, his face grim. They be back with Blackwood and 6 more men tomorrow. We got 12 hours to get ready. Before she could answer, a shout echoed from the lower trail, not from Dutch, but a thin, high cry of pain. Then came the frantic barking of an old hound dog. Silas froze. That's Thomas Miller's dog. He traps the upper basin. He ran down the porch steps, his boots throwing up white clods of snow. Evelyn followed, leaving Lily inside with the heavy bar across the Lanto door. They found Thomas a quarter-mile down, where the trail ran through a field of jagged boulders. The old man was pinned beneath his own pack horse. The mare had slipped on a sheet of black ice, her chest crushed against a rock, her heavy iron-shod leg resting directly across Thomas' left thigh. Blood was already soaking through his buckskin trousers, turning the snow a terrible bright crimson. "Silas," Thomas gasped, his face the color of old flour. "The horse," she went down. "My leg broke to the bone." Silas knelt by the horse's neck. He looked at the mare's eyes. They were glassy and still. She was dead. Her full 600 pounds pinning the old man to the frozen granite. "We gotta lift her, Evelyn," Silas said, his shoulders nodding as he got his hands under the dead mare's saddle horn. "Take Thomas by the shoulders when I heave. You pull him clear." Silas roared, his legs shaking with the strain as he lifted the heavy carcass 3 inches off the dirt. Evelyn gritted her teeth, grabbed Thomas under the armpits, and dragged him backward. The old man shrieked as his broken bones scraped against the frozen ground. Then he went completely limp, fainting from the agony. They got him into the cabin and laid him out on the trestle table under the yellow light of the kerosene lamp. Silas stripped the bloody buckskin away with his hunting knife. The wound was ugly. The jagged white edge of the thigh bone had torn through the meat, and the dark blood was pulsing out in steady, rhythmic spurts. Silas reached into his medicine chest, his big fingers trembling as he pulled out a roll of cotton bandage. "He's bleeding out. Evelyn, I can wrap it, but the pressure won't hold if the artery's ripped. I seen men die of this in the war. It takes a surgeon to tie the vessel." Evelyn pushed Silas aside. Her hands were no longer the hands of the bread seller. They were steady, cool, and fast. "Get the whiskey from the cupboard," she ordered, her voice taking on a sharp professional ring. "And the small brass needles from my sewing basket in the Lianto. Clean 'em in the White Lightning." Silas didn't argue. He moved like a buck private under a Colonel SI. Evelyn knelt by Thomas' thigh. She didn't look at the blood, she looked at the structure beneath. She washed her hands in the raw alcohol, her skin burning from the fumes. Using her bare fingers, she reached directly into the open wound, her thumb pressing down hard against the pulsing vessel near the bone. The bleeding stopped. "You're a doctor?" Silas asked, his breath coming short as he brought the needles. "I was a nurse," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on the red flesh, in the camps down by the Platte, in 73 Point. The Lakota people had the smallpox, and the soldiers had the mini-balls. I stitched 50 men before the winter was through. A Quaker woman named Hannah taught me. She said a needle is just a tool for mercy if you got the stomach to hold the thread. She took the linen thread. Silas had soaked in whiskey. Her fingers moved with an incredible fluid rhythm, over, under, not pull. She didn't have proper forceps or clamps. She used a pair of Silas's small leather pliers to hold the skin back while she worked the brass needle through the muscle, tying off the torn artery with 3 quick, precise knots. The room smelled of copper, raw alcohol, and wood tar. For 20 minutes, the only sound was Thomas' shallow breathing and the sharp snip of Evelyn's scissors. Finally, she stood up. Her apron was covered in dark stains and her knuckles were raw, but her face was perfectly still. She wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve. "The bone is set straight enough," she said, looking at Silas. "He'll keep his leg. But he won't be walking for 3 months." Silas looked at the clean, neat stitches in the old man's leg. Then he looked at Evelyn. The way he looked at her had changed. He didn't see an immigrant widow who needed his protection anymore. He saw a partner, a person who had looked into the worst of the world's pain and hadn't run away. "You spent 6 months in them camps?" Silas asked softly, handing her a clean rag. 6 months, Evelyn said. "Carl didn't like it. He thought it was dangerous. Those people were dying because nobody would look at them." "That's the secret of this territory, Mr. Vane," she said, her voice dropping into a whisper. "The folks in town think they're civilized because they have a bank and a church. But true civilization ain't about the buildings you put up. It's about how you treat the body. That's broken by the side of the road. If you look away from suffering just because it's convenient, you're no better than the wolves." Silas sat down on the bench by the hearth. He looked at his own scarred jaw in the reflection of the dark window pane. "I looked away once," he said, in Cheyenne. "I know," Evelyn said, sitting down across from him, "but you ain't looking away tonight. And tomorrow, when Blackwood comes up that trail, we're going to show this valley what the truth looks like when it stands up in the light." The wind died down near midnight. leaving the mountains so quiet you could hear the frost cracking the spruce bark outside. Thomas was sleeping on the iron cot. His breath was a long, low rattle, but his skin had gone from gray back to a healthy pink. He had wrapped his leg in clean wool, using 2 pine slats as splits to keep the bone from shifting. Silas sat by the hearth. He had an oilstone on his knee, his oil-blackened fingers moving a heavy hunting knife across the gray rock. Slick slack, slick slack. The sound was steady as a clock. Evelyn sat at the trestle table. She had a small cloth-bound notebook open before her. It was old, its corners chewed by mice from some boarding house down in Omaha. She was writing with a stub of a lead pencil, her fingers moving in short, precise strokes. Silas didn't look up. Miss Stone. "What are you putting down there, Mrs. Thorne?" Evelyn paused, her pencil. "The names, mister. The 12 names from the sheriff ledger. The families down in the bottomland. You remember 'em all? A go, a foo, a wit. Don't forget the names of people who share her bread," Evelyn said. Her voice was soft, the German vowels still clinging to the edges of her words like moss on an oak. "There is the Miller family, the O'Briens, the old Swedish couple by the upper ditch. If Blackwood takes their deeds, they have nowhere to go. They do not know the language well enough to fight the railroad lawyers." Silas flipped the knife over, testing the edge against his thumb. A thin line of white skin showed where the steel shaved the hair away. "You're risking your neck for people who didn't lift a finger when Blackwood called you a thief," he said. Evelyn closed the book with a soft thud. She looked at him through the yellow lamplight. "A person's worth don't drop just because they are afraid," she said, her voice small but level. "Folks in town are like sheep when the wolf is at the gate. They look at the dirt because they think if they do not see the teeth will not bite them. You do not punish a man for being small, Mr. Vane. You show him how to stand up by standing up yourself." Silas set the oilstone on the hearth shelf. He looked at her hands, the knuckles still stained with Thomas' blood, the skin red from the lye soap she had used to scrub the table. "My mother used to talk like that," Silas said. He spoke into the fire, his gravelly voice dropping an octave. "She was from the old country. Near Munich, she used to say, 'Ein guter Mann schweigt nicht,' a good man don't stay quiet when the house is burning." Evelyn stared at him, her eyes widening in the dim light. "You speak the language?" "See last?" A ghost of a smile touching the white scar on his jaw. "Not much, just what I remember from the kitchen table when I was a boy in Pennsylvania. Used to sing a song about the pine trees while she was kneading the rye. I ain't heard that tongue spoken since the war." Evelyn looked down at her notebook. The silence came back into the room, but it had changed. It wasn't the cold, suspicious quiet of 2 strangers hiding in a cabin anymore. It was the soft, heavy stillness of 2 people who had found a piece of their own home hidden in the wilderness. She opened the notebook again, turned to a blank page, and began to read aloud, not in English, but in the low, rhythmic German of her childhood. It was a passage from her father's old Bible, about the green pastures and the still waters that stay quiet even when the valley is dark. Silas listened. He didn't move a muscle. His large hands lay flat on his knees, his chin tucked into his collar. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowing until it matched the cadence of her voice. When she stopped, the fire let out a sharp pop, throwing a handful of orange sparks against the stone chimney. Silas opened his eyes. He didn't say thank you. He didn't tell her it was beautiful. He just reached out, took a fresh log from the box, and laid it gently on the coals. His action was the answer. "Out here. You didn't waste breath on pretty words when the wind was rising. You kept the fire hot for the person who was shivering next to you. That was the real language of the frontier, the one that didn't need an alphabet to make its meaning manifest." The Lianto door creaked open and Lily stepped out, her yellow hair tangled from sleep. She blinked against the lamplight, her thumb tucked into her apron string. "Mama," the girl whispered, looking at Silas, then at her mother. "Mr. Vane looks like he's got a heavy heart tonight. You ought to give him that extra piece of gingerbread from the crock." Silas let out a short, dry bark that might have been a laugh if he'd practiced it more. Evelyn covered her mouth with her fingers, her shoulders shaking. "His heart is just fine, Lily Bud," Evelyn said, her eyes bright. "Go on back to bed. The frost is still on the glass." "He don't look fine," Lily muttered, but she turned back into the dark room anyway, her small bare feet quiet on the pine planks. Silas stood up, his tall frame nearly hitting the roof timbers. He went to the door, lifted the heavy iron bar, and stepped out onto the porch into the mountain night. Evelyn followed him to the threshold. The sky was clear now, a dark velvet sheet packed with a million cold stars that looked like salt thrown across a blacksmith's floor. The valley below was a basin of ink, silent and deep. Silas leaned his forearms against the porch rail. "They'll be at the creek by sunrise." "Let them come," Evelyn said, standing beside him. Silas looked down at her. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Thorne. Most folks who get run out of town don't try to save the place that kicked them." "I am not saving the town," Evelyn said, her breath turning to white mist between them. "Saving my daughter's future. A child don't grow straight if she thinks her mother was a coward who ran from a lie. If we give Blackwood these mountains, we are telling Lily that the world belongs to the man with the loudest voice and the biggest gun. I will not leave her that heritage." Silas looked back out at the stars. He stayed there for a long time, his buckskin coat catching the frost until he looked like part of the mountain itself. Evelyn stayed right beside him, neither of them speaking, their shoulders nearly touching as the night turned toward the dawn. The morning didn't bring the sun, it brought a low, yellow haze that smelled of old ice and wet leather. By 6, Silas had the horses harnessed to the light buckboard behind the barn. He hadn't loaded any trunks, he hadn't packed any blankets. The only thing in the back of the wagon was a long cedar box that held his old Pinkerton tools, the spare irons, the legal ledgers from his years in Cheyenne, and 3 boxes of heavy rifle cartridges. "Thomas stays here," Silas said, tightening the cinch on his mare. "Lily stays with him. I left the double barrel by the cot. Anyone comes up that trail who ain't us, Thomas knows how to use his left hand to pull a trigger." Evelyn climbed onto the wooden bench of the wagon, her woolen shawl pinned tight under her chin. Her notebook was tucked into her corset, right against her ribs. "We go to the church first?" she asked. "The church is where Doc Price has told the banker's wife to meet us," Silas said, taking the reins. "Margaret Hargrove won't go to the sheriff's office, and she won't go to the saloon, but she'll go to the altar. A rich woman needs a holy place to look at her own sins." They hadn't even cleared the twin pines at the edge of the timber when the bushes on the left side of the trail exploded. It won a rifle shot. It was the hard, wet crunch of a horse shoulder hitting a spruce bough. Dutch and Sam rode out into the center of the path, their mounts lathered with gray sweat. Dutch had his Winchester resting across his saddlebow, his finger inside the guard. Sam had his hand on his hip, his horse blocking the narrow turn where the road dropped into the canyon. "Going somewhere, Silas?" Dutch called out. His horse snorted, throwing bloody foam onto the snow. "The sheriff's down at the bridge. He has got an order from the circuit judge. Nobody leaves the mountain until the Thorne property is settled." Silas didn't pull the reins. He let the buckboard roll until the horses' noses were 3 feet from Sam's stirrup. Then he set the brake with a sharp metallic clack. "The road's public, Dutch," Silas said. His voice was level, almost conversational, and "I'm legal counsel for Mrs. Thorne. We're going down to see the magistrate." Sam let out a greasy laugh, his pockmarked face turning red in the wind. "The only magistrate you're going to see is the one inside Blackwood's pocket, Vane. Get down off that box." Dutch raised the Winchester an inch, the muzzle pointing straight at Silas Brisket. "We ain't joking. Old man, the railroad don't wait for no mountain hermits. The notebook she's got in her coat, and maybe we let you drive that wagon back to your cabin." Evelyn felt her heart hit her ribs like a trapped bird, but her hand didn't tremble as she reached under her shawl. She didn't pull a gun. She pulled out the small, cloth-bound ledger. "You want the names?" she called out, her voice cutting through the rattle of the harness. "You want to see what your master is buying with his 20 cents an acre? Look at 'em, Dutch. Your own cousin's name is on page 4, the O'Briens. He's selling the land out from under your own kin while you stand in the mud holding his rifle." Dutch hesitated. His eye flicked to the notebook in her hand, then to Sam. "A bully don't mind hurting a stranger, but a bully gets careful when the mirror shows his own blood." "She's lying," Sam muttered, his hand moving toward his revolver. "Take the book, Dutch." What happened next didn't look like a play or a storybook fight. It was fast, lumpy, and loud with the smell of burnt powder. Sam pulled his Colt. "Get it level." Silas didn't reach for his belt. He took the heavy hickory wagon whip from the socket by his seat and brought it down with a sound like a pistol shot. The leather thong caught Sam across the knuckles, tearing the skin to the bone. The Colt dropped into the gray slush, discharging once into the ground with a dull thump. Sam roared, his horse rearing back, its iron shoes slipping on the black ice. Dutch swung his Winchester toward Silas. But Evelyn didn't sit there like a sack of flour. She grabbed the iron brake lever with both hands. Throwing her whole weight against it, the heavy buckboard lurched sideways, the iron-rimmed wheels striking a hidden boulder under the snow. The jolt threw Dutch's horse off balance just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet went wide, ripping through the canvas hood of the wagon 2 inches above Eveline's bonnet. Silas was over the seat before the smoke could clear. He didn't look like an old man then. He looked like the giant who had cleared the Black Ridge timber with his bare arms. Dutch around the waist, lifting the younger man clean out of the stirrups. They went down together into the deep drift by the ditch, a tangle of wool coats, heavy boots, and gray snow. Dutch fought like a trapped badger, gouging at Silas' eyes. His gray teeth bared, he caught Silas across the jaw with his elbow, reopening the old white scar until the red blood ran down into his gray beard. Silas didn't flinch. He took the blow, got his forearm under Dutch's chin, and pressed down into the snow until the regulator's eyes began to roll back into his head. "Sam," Dutch choked out, his hands clawing at the frozen ground. "Help me." But Sam wasn't looking at the drift. He was looking at Evelyn. She had crawled over the seat into the back of the buckboard. She had Silas' old cedar box open. She didn't have a shotgun. She had a heavy iron-frame Pinkerton carbine she had never fired in her life. She rested the long barrel across the wooden sideboard of the wagon, her shoulder braced against the seat back. "Get off your horse," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have a shake in it. "You look at me, Sam," she said, her thumb drawing the big hammer back until it locked with a double click. "I have seen 50 men die in the mud by the Platte. I know what a bullet does to a body. And I ain't afraid of the sight of it. You drop your belt into that ditch, or I'll let this lead find your middle before you can touch that stirrup leather." Sam looked at the muzzle of the carbine. It looked as big as a stovepipe in the gray light. He looked at her eyes, the cold, steady gaze of the woman who had tied Thomas Miller's artery with a sewing needle while the room was swimming in blood. He knew she wasn't bluffing. A rogue can smell fear in a person, but he can smell certainty too. Sam raised his hands, his fingers shaking as he unbuckled his gun belt and let it drop into the frozen water of the irrigation ditch. "Splash, we was just doing our job, lady," he muttered, his face pale under his pockmarks. "Your job is done," Evelyn said. Silas rose from the snow, his face covered in gray mud and red blood. He took a length of hemp rope from the wagon box and tied Dutch's wrists behind his back, securing the knot with a hard jerk of his shoulder. He didn't say a word of triumph. He didn't curse. His actions were just the final entry in a long afternoon of work. "Tie Sam's horse to the tailgate, Evelyn," Silas said, wiping the red smear from his jaw with his sleeve. "We take them with us? We take them to the church," Silas said, climbing back onto the bench. "Blackwood S. waiting at the lower bridge, but he's got to come through the town square to get to the railhead. We're gonna let the folks in Coldwater Creek see what his law looks like when it tied up in the back of a wood wagon." Evelyn climbed back up beside him, the carbine resting across her knees. Her skirt was torn, her apron was ruined, and the wind was blowing the cold sleet right into her face. But as the horses started down the long draft toward the valley, she didn't feel the chill at all. She looked at Silas' hands on the reins, steady, firm, and scarred, and she knew the mountain had finally come down into the light. The white spire of the Coldwater Creek Methodist Church didn't look like a sanctuary that morning. It looked like an outpost. The pine siding had peeled under the fierce Wyoming wind, leaving the wood gray and splintered. They sat at the northern edge of the town square, facing the livery stable and the limestone front of the bank. Silas pulled the horses to a halt in the alley behind the parsonage. The wagon groaned as the iron brakes bit into the slush. In the back, Dutch and Sam sat shoulder to shoulder, their wrists bound tight with hemp rope, their heads hung low to keep the sleet out of their collars. Evelyn didn't wait for Silas to climb down. She set the Pinkerton carbine against the wooden bench and hopped from the wheel hub, her boots sinking 3 inches into the gray mud. Her notebook was still pressed flat against her ribs. "You stay with the horses, Mr. Vane," she said. Her breath was short, forming small plumes of white in the alley. "If Blackwood sees you first, he'll start shooting. Before the ledger is out of my pocket. He needs a reason to call you an outlaw. Don't give it to him." Silas held the leather reins loose in his big palms. The blood from his jaw had dried into a dark crust along his graying beard. He looked at the heavy oak door of the church, then down at her. "Margaret Hargrove is a proud woman, Evelyn," he said, using her Christian name for the first time without realizing it. "She ain't used to looking at the mud on her own hem. You go in there soft, and she'll freeze you out." You go in there hard and she'll call the deputies." Evelyn adjusted her wool shawl, pinning it tighter across her chest. "I am not going in there as a beggar, Mr. Vane," she said, "and I am not going in there to throw stones. A person who seeks justice must bring the truth, not anger. Anger is just a fog that hides the trail. If I let my hatred for Blackwood speak for me, I am no better than the men who put those ropes on Dutch's wrists. True justice don't look to destroy a man, it looks to set the scales level again." Silas nodded once, a slow, heavy drop of his chin. "The side door is unlatched. Doc Price said he leave the key in the woodbox. The inside of the church was cold as a well. Of tallow candles and damp wool hung in the nave, thick and heavy. A single iron stove sat in the center aisle, but nobody built a fire in it since Sunday morning. The pews were long rows of unpainted pine, scrubbed clean by the women of the parish. Margaret Hargrove sat in the second row near the pulpit. She wore a dark green mantle with a collar of black fox fur. Her hands were tucked into a matching muff, her chin held high as she stared at the empty altar. She didn't turn around when the door creaked. Evelyn walked down the center aisle. Her wet skirts made a heavy draggings against the floorboards, swish, thud, swish. She stopped 3 feet from the banker's wife. "Mrs. Hargrove," Evelyn said. The older woman turned her head slow. Her face was pale, the skin around her eyes tight with a fatigue that didn't come from a lack of sleep. Looked at Evelyn's torn skirt, the dried mud on her sleeves, and the dark stain where Thomas' blood had soaked through her apron the night before. "The doctor said you would be here, Mrs. Thorne," Margaret said. Her voice was thin, like glass that had sat too long in the sun. "He told me you had something to show me. He said my husband's name was involved in an ugliness." Evelyn reached into her bodice and pulled out the small cloth-bound notebook. She didn't hand it over. She opened it to page 1, holding the paper steady under the dim light from the frosted window. "This is the ledger from the sheriff's desk," Evelyn said, in his own hand. 12 pieces of land marked for reclamation. My name is at the top. But look at the next one. That is Peter O'Brien's farm. 4 children under the age of 7. His wife is buried behind the cabin. If Blackwood takes his title, where do those children sleep come January?" Margaret looked at the paper. Her small, dark eyes tracked the copperplate handwriting. "My husband handles the railroad accounts. He is a businessman, Mrs. Thorne. He does not control the actions of the sheriff. He holds the money, Mrs. Hargrove," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a low, firm rhythm. "And a man who holds the purse for a thief is just holding the bag while the house is robbed. Your husband knows these deeds are fraudulent. He knows the railroad is paying 20 cents an acre for land that took 10 years of blood to clear. He is letting Blackwood do the dirty work because it keeps his own white collars clean. But a sin don't turn into a virtue just because you hire another man to commit it." Margaret stood up. Black Fox collar shook as she drew herself tall. "You are an accused thief yourself, ma'am. The sheriff has witnesses." Evelyn took a step closer. She didn't raise her hands, but she didn't step back either. Her eyes spoke what she didn't say aloud. She had stood in the dirt while the whole town looked away, and she had survived it. The power of a uniform or a bank account didn't intimidate a woman who had sewn a man's artery together by the light of a greasy lamp. She was showing Margaret that dignity wasn't something you bought in Denver. It was the skin you refused to shed when the biped wolves were howling. "The witnesses are tied up in the back of Silas Vane's wood wagon in the alley," Evelyn said quietly. "Dutch and Sam. They tried to take this book from me on the trail. They tried to put a bullet through my bonnet. You can go out the side door and ask them yourself whose silver they were looking for." Margaret looked from the notebook to the side door. Her lips narrowed into a thin white line. For 3 years she had been the queen of Coldwater Creek, looking down from her brick house at the immigrant women who washed her sheets and baked her bread. Believed the world was ordered by Providence, the rich on top, the poor below, and the law keeping the peace between them. But as she looked at the names in Evelyn's book, she saw the names of her own neighbors. She saw the name of the Swedish woman who had brought her wild blackberries when she was sick with the ague. "If this is true," Margaret whispered, "my husband's honor is gone." "Honor is like a horse, Mrs. Hargrove," Evelyn said, her voice softening just a fraction. "It can be stolen from you, or it can be sold by your own hand. But if it's sold, you're the one who has to live with the empty stable. Your husband can still change his entry in the book. He can refuse to sign the corporate transfer before the circuit judge arrives tomorrow." Margaret took her hands out of her muff. Her fingers were jeweled, but they were trembling. She reached out and touched the edge of Evelyn's notebook. "Come with me," Margaret said. "We are going to the bank." The wind caught the bank door as they went in, slamming the heavy walnut frame against the brass latch with a sound like a pistol shot. Henry Hargrove sat behind his frosted glass partition, a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, a mountain of yellow paper spread out before him. A small man with thin hair and a mouth that looked like a purse that had been drawn tight with a string. He looked up, his eyes widening behind the lenses as he saw his wife enter, followed by Evelyn Thorne and the massive, mud-splattered figure of Silas Vane, who stood by the threshold like an ancient cedar that had been dragged inside. "Margaret," the banker, rising from his velvet chair, "what is the meaning of this? This woman is wanted under a warrant from the sheriff. You shouldn't be seen in her company." Margaret Hargrove walked straight to the desk. She didn't take off her gloves. She took the cloth-bound notebook from Evelyn's fingers and dropped it directly onto her husband's ledger. "Look at the writing, Henry," Margaret said. Her voice didn't have the glassiness now. It had the hard ring of an Easton schoolmistress. "Is that Mordecai Blackwood's hand?" Hargrove adjusted his spectacles. He looked at the names, then at the numbers in the margin. 20 10 cash not reserve, Central Mountainer. His face went from white to gray, the color of wet lime. "Where did you get this?" he muttered, his eyes flicking toward Silas by the door. "It came off your desk, Henry," Silas said from the back of the room. This was a low, gravelly rumble that made the glass oil lamps on the wall vibrate. "Or near enough to it. The sheriff Reese been using your ledger numbers to clear the valley. It's got Dutch and Sam out in my wagon right now with their wrists tied. They told us everything we need to know about where the money's being held." Hargrove sank back into his chair. His small hands hovered over the papers like two pale spiders. "It's a legal transaction, Silas. The railroad has a right-of-way charter from the territorial governor. If these people don't sell, the county will condemn the land anyway. I'm just trying to keep the town from being bypassed by the tracks. If the steel goes through Buffalo Creek instead of here, Coldwater Creek is dead in 5 years." Silas walked forward. His boots left tracks of black, frozen mud across the expensive wool rug. He stopped right at the edge of the mahogany desk, his giant frame casting a long, dark shadow over the banker's papers. "A town don't stay alive by killing its own people, Henry," Silas said. "Build a town on a lie like that, and you're just putting a roof over a graveyard. The railroad steel is coming. We all know that. Progress don't look back for no man's fence. But progress don't give a lawman the right to manufacture a thief out of an honest woman just to clear a title. You sign those transfers and you're putting your name to a robbery." Hargrove looked down at his desk. "The circuit judge is at the hotel. He signs the condemnation orders tomorrow at noon. If I withhold the bank seal, the railroad will pull their deposits. They'll ruin me, Margaret." His wife looked at him. She didn't look at his fine suit or his gold pocket watch. She looked at the smallness of his shoulders under the gray wool. "Let them pull the money, Henry," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't leave any room for discussion. "We came to this territory with nothing but an iron kettle and 2 blankets. We have to go back to the kettle. We will do it with our heads up. I will not sit in that house on the hill knowing the bread we eat was stolen from the O'Brien children. You give Mrs. Thorne her clear title, and you give the doctor the papers for the other 11 families. That is the only business we have left in this valley." The banker sat silent for a long time, the only sound the steady, dry tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then slowly, he reached into his drawer, pulled out a heavy iron press, and slid the 12 disputed deeds under the die. One by one, the iron lever came down with a sharp, heavy clack, clack, clack. The gold seal of the Wyoming territory was pressed into the paper. White and official, he handed the stack to Evelyn. His fingers were shaking, but his eyes were clear. "This makes a manifest, Mrs. Thorne. The railroad will have to buy the land at the market price, $3 an acre, or they'll have to bend the tracks around the creek. The sheriff can touch you now." Evelyn took the papers. She didn't say thank you. She didn't feel the need to express gratitude for what was already hers by right of her husband's sweat. She tucked the deeds under her shawl next to her notebook. Her actions were the real weight of the moment. She didn't celebrate. She didn't boast. She stood there like an anchor in a gale, showing the banker and his wife that the true law of the country wasn't found in the railroad office or the governor's mansion. It was found in the marrow of the people who refused to be broken by the machinery of wealth. She had won her peace, but her face stayed as grave as the mountain she had left behind. When they stepped back out onto the street, the sun had finally broken through the yellow haze, turning the slush into a field of blinding white diamond sparks. Sheriff Mordecai Blackwood was waiting for them in the center of the square. He had 4 deputies with him, their heavy winter coats unbuttoned, their hands resting on the grips of their sidearms. Blackwood stood with his boots wide apart, his brass star catching the noon glare. He looked at the buckboard in the alley, then at Silas and Evelyn as they came down the bank steps. "Silas," Blackwood called out, his deep voice bouncing off the wooden storefronts. "You've gone too far this time. You've got 2 citizens tied up in your wagon, and you're interfering with a county warrant. Your hands away from your belt." Silas didn't reach for his gun. He walked down the steps, his face perfectly calm, the dried blood on his jaw showing red in the sunlight. He stopped 10 paces from the sheriff. "The warrant's dead, Mordecai," Silas said. "Henry Hargrove just put the bank seal on the deeds. The land belongs to the folks who cleared it. The railroad's going to have to pay the full price, and your 20-cent bonus just went down the river." Blackwood's hand twitched. He looked past Silas to the bank window, where Henry Hargrove and his wife were standing together behind the frosted glass, watching the street. The sheriff knew the play was over. The banker's signature was the only thing that made his land grab look like the law. Without it, he was just an old man with a badge trying to rob a widow in broad daylight. The deputies behind him shifted their feet, looking from Blackwood to Silas, then to the heavy Pinkerton carbine Evelyn was holding loose across her arm. They weren't paid enough to die for a railroad contract that had just gone sour. "You think you're safe up on that hill, Vane?" Blackwood muttered, his voice losing its resonance, turning flat and bitter as vinegar. "Be safe anywhere, Sheriff," Silas said quietly. "We were all just one bad choice away from the dark. You used to be a good lawman, Mordecai. I remember when you took the cattle thieves out at Crazy Woman Creek in 74 Point. You didn't take no bribes then. You let the money spoil you because you thought nobody was looking. But the mountain's always looking. And the truth don't stay under the snow forever." Blackwood looked down at his own boots. He didn't pull his Colt. He turned around without a word and walked toward his office, his boots making a heavy, lonely sound in the slush. The deputies followed him, their hands dropping away from their holsters. The crowd that had gathered at the edge of the livery stable began to disperse, people talking in low, hurried whispers. None of them came over to Evelyn. None of them said they were sorry for the lie they had believed on Friday morning. Still the same town-bred folk, cautious and small, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before they risked a greeting. Silas walked back to the buckboard, lifted the iron bar and looked at Evelyn. The white scar on his jaw looked less like an old wound now, and more like a line drawn by a carpenter to mark a square corner. "The road back up is going to be slick," he said, taking the horses by the bits, "but the fire's still hot in the cabin, and Thomas will be wanting his supper." Evelyn climbed up onto the bench, setting the Pinkerton carbine between her knees. She looked out over the roofs of Coldwater Creek toward the high, dark wall of Black Ridge Mountain, where the pine trees were catching the gold of the afternoon sun. "Let's go home, Mr. Vane," she said. "The air is cleaner up there." The snow didn't stay on the southern slopes of Black Ridge past the middle of February. It melted off in big, weeping patches, leaving the granite gray and wet under the pale mountain sun. By April, the smell of damp pine needles and fresh cedar sap was so thick it nearly covered the scent of the winter tallow in the cabin. Silas Vane stood by the open door of the Liento, his shirt sleeves rolled up past his thick forearms. He wasn't holding a rifle or an axe today. He had a wooden trencher filled with fresh bread dough, his big, scarred hands turning the flour-white mass over and over with a steady, soft rhythm: thwack, fold, push. Thorne sat at the trestle table behind him, a needle and a spool of linen thread in her fingers. She was sewing a small linen shirt much smaller than anything Lily had ever worn. Her waist had grown round over the winter, the heavy wool of her blue dress straining slightly against her apron string. Silas stopped his kneading, his blue eyes looking out toward the lower clearing where the wild sunflowers were beginning to poke their green ears through the gravel. "The railroad grading crews reached the bottomland yesterday," he said. His voice was a low rumble, matching the purr of the iron stove. "Peter O'Brien sold him the right-of-way for $3.50 an acre. He's building a new frame house with a tin roof down by the crossing, Evelyn didn't look up from her needle. He kept his timber lot. He kept it, Silas said, dropping the dough back into the trencher with a wet smack. The company had to bend the iron 2 miles south to miss his orchard. The surveyors didn't like the curve, but the bank deeds held him plumb. He wiped the white flour from his knuckles onto his apron. He looked at the row of books on his shelf, then down at his own palms. I used to think this mountain was an island, Evelyn, he said, using her name with the ease of a man who had said it every day through the hard freezes. I thought if a man climbed high enough and stayed quiet enough, the world would forget to send its bills to his door. The world don't stop at the tree line. It follows you up on a horse, or it follows you up on steel rails. Evelyn pulled the linen thread tight, locking the stitch with a neat double knot. A person don't find peace by running away from the noise, Silas, she said, her voice steady and clear as the creek water. Peace ain't a place where there is no trouble. It's the choice you make to keep your soul steady while the bow of the storm is rattling the shingles. If we had stayed hidden up here and let Blackwood take that valley, the mountain would have just been a prison with a bigger view. True freedom is the willingness to walk back down into the dirt when the truth needs an anchor. Silas looked at her for a long moment, the white scar on his jaw softening in the yellow light from the window. I reckon that's the entry I should have written in 72, he said softly. The door to the porch swung wide and Lily came running in, her face bright with the mountain air. She was 11 now, her legs long and her yellow hair tied back with a scrap of green ribbon Margaret Hargrove had sent up with the mail rider last month. She carried a bundle of wild onion tops and 3 brown eggs from the cedar coop Silas had built behind the barn. Mr. Vane, Lily said, setting the eggs gently in the willow basket by the stove, the old mare standing by the gate. She wants her oats, and she won't let me put the halter on her unless you're there to tell her it's proper. Silas took off his apron and hung it on the wooden peg by the hearth. He reached down and pulled one of Lily's yellow braids, his big face twisting into that slow, rare smile that had become common around the cabin since the wood smoke had turned sweet. A horse is like a town politician, Lilybud, Silas said, taking his hat from the peg. She knows exactly how much strength you got in your wrist before she decides to mind you. You go on back out there and stand square, don't. Look at her ears, look at her shoulder. She'll know you mean business if your boots are flat on the sod. The girl nodded once, her small chin coming up with that same stubborn line Evelyn had carried into the church square. She turned and trotted back down the path, her bare feet making a light, happy sound against the grass. Evelyn watched her go from the window. The rattling in Lily's chest had gone with the November ice, replaced by a deep, healthy breath that could carry her up the ridge without a pause. Thomas Miller sent a letter with the freighter, Evelyn said, her fingers returning to the small linen shirt. He's down in Cheyenne now. His leg healed straight enough for him to take a job as a clerk in the land office. He says he don't miss the trapping much, but he misses your coffee. Silas stopped at the threshold, his hand resting on the heavy oak doorframe. It was dark from the grease of his hands, worn smooth at the height where his shoulder leaned when he was thinking. Thomas was a good scout, Silas said into the clearing, but he never did know how to keep his firewood dry. A man who lives alone too long forgets that tomorrow's going to need a dry stick just as bad as today. He stepped out onto the porch, but he didn't go to the barn right away. He stood by the rail, looking out over the valley where the thin, black line of the new railroad grading showed like an old scar through the greening buffalo grass. Evelyn came out and stood beside him, her hand sliding naturally into the wide, rough space of his palm. His fingers closed over hers, not tight, but firm. The way he held the reins when the road was good and the horses knew the way home. They didn't need a preacher to say words over them under a stained glass window. The commitment wasn't in a gold ring or a piece of parchment signed by a clerk in Denver. It was manifest in the pile of 4 deep oak wood against the north wall, in the garden plot that had been cleared of stone by their common labor, and in the small child that was growing quiet and safe under Evelyn's heart. They were 2 people who had been broken by the world in different corners, but they had found a way to let the pieces fit together until the seam was the strongest part of the timber. A mile down the trail, a lone rider was coming through the scrub oak, his gray mule moving slow against the grade. It was Doc Price, his old buffalo robe rolled up behind his saddle, his black bag thumping against the stirrup leather. He was coming up for his weekly cup of chicory tea and to check the pulse under Evelyn's apron. Silas looked down at the rider, then down at Evelyn's hand in his. "The town's coming up the hill, Evelyn," he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic cadence of the high timber. Evelyn leaned her head against his buckskin shoulder, her eyes fixed on the white spire of the church that was just visible through the trees 5 miles below. "Let 'em come, Silas," she said softly. "We got enough bread for all of them." In the back of the small notebook tucked into the drawer of the sea chest, beneath the 12 names of the families who had kept their land, Lily would write a line many years later, when her own hair had taken on the color of the Blackridge frost. "My mother was never a thief," the ink would say, faded but clear on the yellow paper, and Mr. Vane was never the monster the newspapers made him out to be. They were just two people who refused to look down at the dirt when the world told them to be quiet. They stood up for each other when standing was a dangerous business, and because they did, the mountain stayed high enough for the rest of us to breathe. The wind blew soft through the spruce needles, then a long, clean sigh that carried the scent of the coming summer down into the valley, leaving the clearing quiet, whole, and manifest in the light. This fictional story may include themes of romance, betrayal, violence, hardship, or emotional distress that could be sensitive for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised, as the purpose of these scenes is to create dramatic tension and emotional depth within the narrative world.
If this story moved something in you, let it live on. Leave a like. Share it with someone whose spirit needs a fire tonight. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe so the next story finds its way to you before the next cold comes in. At the very end of this story, a grown woman sits down to write a single line about her mother in the back of an old notebook. She doesn't write about heroism or legend. She writes something far simpler and far more powerful. They stood up for each other when standing was a dangerous business. That sentence is the whole heart of everything this story has been trying to tell us, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we let it go. Because this is not, at its core, a story about a corrupt sheriff, or a railroad company, or a woman falsely accused in the mud of a frontier market. It is a story about what it costs, and what it means, to refuse to look down at the dirt when the world commands you to be silent. Evelyn Thorne was given every reason to run. The crowd looked away. The neighbors turned their backs. The law itself had been turned into a weapon against her. And yet she did not run. Not because she was fearless, but because she understood something that the powerful in Coldwater Creek had long since forgotten. A person who gives up their truth to save their comfort has already lost the thing they were trying to protect. She was not fighting for an acre of Wyoming soil. She was fighting for the story her daughter would carry for the rest of her life. The second great truth this story offers us lives inside the character of Silas Vane, the man who had spent years climbing higher and higher up a mountain, trying to get far enough away from a single, terrible moment that he could no longer hear it calling his name. There is a profound and honest lesson in watching a man use a wilderness as a prison, believing that isolation is the same thing as penance. It isn't. Silas had punished himself with silence and solitude, but he had not healed. He had simply stopped moving. What brought him back to life was not absolution from a preacher or forgiveness from a court. It was the daily, ordinary work of being useful to another person, holding the other end of a crosscut saw, wrapping a child in a warm coat, carrying a wounded man out of the snow. Silas discovered what so many broken souls eventually discover, that we cannot think our way out of the damage we have done to the world. We can only work our way back toward it, one clean line in the ledger at a time. His life was not a single entry from 1872. It was the whole book, and the whole book was worth reading. But perhaps the deepest lesson of all belongs to the mountain itself, the place this story uses as both a setting and a symbol. Early in the story, Silas tells Evelyn not to look at the summit when the trail gets steep. "Look 3 feet ahead of your own toes," he says. "The mountain don't conquer a body all at once. It does it inch by inch, while you're busy looking at the top. It is one of the most quietly profound pieces of wisdom in the entire story, and it applies to far more than a trail through the Wyoming timber. It applies to grief. It applies to debt. It applies to any mountain of injustice or loss that rises up in a person's path and seems too vast to cross. You do not face the whole thing at once. You face the next 3 feet. You keep your boots flat on the sod, and your eyes steady, and you trust that the work you are doing right now is building something real, even when you cannot yet see the clearing at the top." Evelyn and Silas didn't save the valley with a single dramatic act. They saved it with 11 consecutive days of split wood, salted meat, steady hands, and honest words spoken in the right rooms at the right time. That is what makes their victory feel true. Because true freedom, as Evelyn says near the end, is not a place where there is no storm. It is the choice to keep your soul steady while the storm is rattling the shingles. And when 2 people find the courage to make that choice together, to stand in the dirt with their chins up, not for glory, but for the children who are watching, the mountain stays high enough for all the rest of us to breathe.